couple of things first. You do have papers coming up, so I just wanted to remind you, in case you didn't know, that on the website, the school's main website, there is a spot, I want to say it's right near where, like there's a tab that you can come down to go to My OSC where the class is. I believe on that same drop down, when you put your cursor over that where you go to My OSC, there is a page with some videos that I recorded about how to write a paper, right? So if you haven't seen that, I would check that out, because I do the whole thing. I show you, how to go from beginning to end. I have a sample paper up there. So if you didn't see that, you can always look at that if you're wondering what they should look like. And, and it's a process. So when you read, that affects your ability to write, right? Because as you read more, you have more information, you have more thoughts, and as you write, it causes you to think about how you want to say it in a good way. Because if you don't have the thoughts, you can't do the writing, right? So if you haven't been reading or learning or getting in new information, then your writing is going to be limited, because you're only going to be writing from your own experience, from things you already knew, from stuff off the top of your head. And so when you become a reader, right, just in general in your life, you begin to bring in more information, and that helps you with the writing process, right? Because you have more things to pull from. You have more things that you already kind of know. You know where to find stuff. So reading influences your ability to write well. If you don't have good information, it's hard to write well. The process of writing, which is, sometimes, in high school, they tend to have you write things and it feels more like busy work. We want to avoid that in college by thinking about it correctly, that when you're writing something, you're taking information now that you have learned, and you're trying to figure out what is the best way to say it, right? And so you're formulating with your own thoughts. You may put a rough draft up there and then go back and work on it so that you've put your thoughts on the paper, and then you're going back in and thinking about each statement that you made and saying, did I say that the right way? Is there a better way that I could have said that? And that process of going back in and thinking about how you said what you said influences your ability to speak well, right? So all of it is about becoming a better communicator. So if you learn to read well, it influences your ability to write. And in that process of writing, you are forcing yourself to think about the best way to say what you already know. And that causes you to become a better speaker, right? And so that's why at this level, we still require people to put their thoughts down into paper. It's not about taking up your free time and your nights and that kind of stuff. It is about forcing you to think about the best way to say what your brain already knows, right? We've probably all been through experiences where you know something, you've heard it, somebody's told it to you, and then you turn around and try and repeat the same thing that you heard very clearly, and you kind of stumble over it at spots. If any of you are going into ministry, you will find that a sermon that you wrote yourself, you can have a hard time saying, it is your own sermon, that you, in your own free time, you put together a sermon, and if anybody should know how to say it, you should, because you're the one that wrote it. And then you get up to start to speak it, and then all of a sudden you stumble over your thoughts a little bit, which is why when you're a beginning speaker trying to get used to being in front of people, it's always important to preach your sermons a couple of times when nobody else is around, because there is something about making that connection between what you know and your mouth, right, and actually saying it, that there is a difference between being able to envision a thought in your brain and that feeling of saying, oh yeah, I understand that, versus actually being able to put it into words. And so that's what we want, because if you can't put your thoughts into clear words, then they just kind of remain vague ideas in your own mind, and you're not as sharp in your own thinking. So that's the reason that we still include these things at this level, is we want you to be reading so that you're getting in new information. We want you to be writing, not just for busy work, but so that you are sharpening your ability to say and to communicate what you know and what you're learning, right? So that the end result is when you turn around to be a blessing to someone else and teach these things, you are giving them a well thought out response because you've thought through these things in your paper, right? So that's why we do that. It's to influence your ability to communicate and to know these things really well, right? So as just a refresher, because normally about this time we start hitting the papers, and I just want everybody to be on the same page about how I view it, because if you just see it as busy work, it becomes very boring, and we're all adults, we're all busy, we don't want to do anything that's not fruitful. So you got to think about it in the right way so that it has the most benefit for you, right? Because if you think of it as busy work, then it's just, oh my goodness. But then if you think about it as, man, I'm learning how to think about this subject with accuracy and with clarity, then all of a sudden you can see a little more benefit from what you're doing. So that's important. And just while we're on the subject of some school kind of things, I think it's important for everyone, if you can, while you're in school and you're thinking and you're trying to stretch yourself as a learner, to spend some time addressing how you go about studying on a daily basis, how you go about seeking to learn more of the Word on a daily basis, right? Because when you leave school, you want to have developed habits that then you take with you for the rest of your life. That's the whole point of this, is not to teach you everything that you need to know. It is to expose you to things and help you to develop some habits so that when these years are over, you start the real process of really learning, because in 2 or 3 years, you're going to learn quite a bit, but then you've still got the entire rest of your life that you want to be learning and growing and stretching yourself. So while you're a student is the best time. If you don't have a really good routine for learning, particularly learning about the Word, then now is a good time to develop that. That's been the single most important thing in my development, was not school. I learned much more out of school than I learned in school. So in school, kind of, particularly at the Bible college that I went to, I think I teach these classes at a higher level than any of the classes I received at schools I paid a lot of money to go to. So the benefit of those schools really wasn't the classroom education, really. The benefit of those schools was being around other Christian people at a young age and developing character from being around other people that were hungry to learn more about the Lord. But in terms of just learning information and growing as a knowledgeable follower of Christ, I learned way more outside of school than I ever learned in school, because of that habit of getting up every morning and spending the first hour or two of every day studying something from the Word. That sounds hard. It's just like anything. I mean, everybody has some kind of a routine, so you get to define what your routine is. For some people, it's getting up and drinking coffee. Everybody has to get ready. Everybody has to brush their teeth. Everybody has to do stuff with their family. I mean, everybody's got a routine. You get to decide what your routine is. And so for me, that was the single greatest piece to the puzzle, was taking those first couple hours. And we see all through the scriptures, the prophets, the great kings like David, they would say things like, early in the morning, I'll seek your face, right? That there is something to that. Just like when God asks for offering, it is the first fruits of the offering. When God destroys a phone, it is the first one that goes off in the class. That it is always the first fruit that the Lord is after, right? And so in your study time, you will find that the beginning of your day is a good time. You may have to drink some coffee. You may have to drink something to wake yourself up, which is what I do every morning. I drink some kind of energy drink or something while I'm reading, and I enjoy doing that, and it gives me a way to wake up in the morning while I'm studying. But I think that's an important thing for everyone to be stretching yourself in while you're here, because that's the part you take with you, right? I mean, you furiously take notes, but truth be told, you're going to only remember the highlights of some of these classes. You're not going to remember a lot of the detail that I've given you. I mean, so it is good to have the notes so you can go back, but you could always go back in once you know the general idea that I talked about. You can go back in and research this stuff yourself and remind yourself about the specifics. But what you take with you are the habits, right? And so that's why I take some time to speak on that, because when the class is over, if all you have is the notes and the lectures, then your benefit ends when the class ends. If you have developed some habits along the way, that's the part that you take with you. And so that's why I want to make sure that everybody's at least exposed to that thought that you should be developing habits just as furiously as you're doing anything else. Because that's really the important part. When you leave here, did you become a lifelong learner? Because that's the goal. So what I do every morning, and this is just an example, just to put a model out there that you can follow. So the first thing I always do is I read just something just straight from the Bible just to start. So maybe just like a chapter or something from the Bible. And then I always have a commentary. And for me, this is key. And if you don't have any, you should get some. A commentary is some other person who is a scholar in the church or something who has spent their life studying, say, the book of Ephesians or something. And so they go down, they sit down, they write a book about Ephesians that's maybe 400 or 500 pages long, right? Which is a lot of detail for such a small book that's only like 6 pages long in the Bible. And so I have commentaries on Matthew that's 1,200 pages long. And by the time you read all of that, and I know that sounds intimidating, but I only read, truth be told, from the commentaries because it's small print, I only read about 10 pages a day from these commentaries in the morning. If your average commentary is, say, 500 pages, that means, what's that, 50 days, 2 months, you read one? So that's maybe you'd read 6 of these commentaries a year, which means after 5 or 10 years, you've read, 60 in 10 years, which is more than an entire, one of those huge books on every book of the Bible you could have done in 5 to 10 years, depending on how fast you go, right? And so, and at no point do you ever do more than about 10 pages per day or so, but it is the slow and steady accumulation of the reading that begins to add up. And by the time you've spent about 5 or 10 years, right, because 5 or 10 years is going to come and go whether you do this or not. It's like somebody said, oh man, 10 years of studying, I'll be, whatever age then. And, well, the follow-up question is, well, how old would you be in 10 years if you didn't study, right? It's the same difference. So it's just the accumulation of information, the accumulation of exposure over time, it begins to build on itself. That at first, some of the vocabulary and things that they have in there you don't know, but after a while you begin to learn things. And after you've read a commentary on Isaiah, and then you come back around and you read one on the Gospels, then you begin to realize that 20% of the Gospels Jesus is quoting from Isaiah, and it didn't make sense to you until you began to understand that he's not just telling you something, he's quoting something that God was speaking for a long time. And so then they begin to build and your information begins to multiply. So anyways, every day I read some kind of commentary on the Bible because it's very difficult for you to grow in your understanding of the Word if all you ever have is your own thoughts, right? That you want to be bringing in the thoughts of someone else who has studied the Word, this particular book, for their whole life. They are in a good spot to teach you the world of that particular book, right? And so you don't want to be dependent on a church to feed you, right? That's the most obnoxious thing, to have a 25-year-old that still expects their parents to make them sandwiches and things like that. I mean, at some point, you've got to be able to feed yourself, right? And so that's really what we want. The church is extra, but you as an adult have learned to feed yourself is the goal, right? You want to be able to do this. Now, if one of these is 500 pages and you read 10 a day, that's about one every 2 months, right? So even though some of these could be expensive, even up to maybe $40, you're really only talking about $20 a month or something like that to change the way you are able to understand. And after a while, these things begin to add up. They're not all that way. You can find them on Amazon. Sometimes you can find some things cheaper. But whatever it is, it's not like you're having to buy this every day or every week. I mean, when you get one of these books, it could take you, I've spent 6 or 7 months sometimes on one of these massive books, So, but then over having done this for 16 years, I've read hundreds and hundreds of these now, and it begins to add up. And so, to me, this is one of the most important things. And then I always read a third book on just something to do with Christian life of some kind. And these are a little faster reads, like some kind of a devotional book of some kind, a Max Lucado, John Maxwell, some kind of book that is teaching you how to live properly, right? Because these are going to teach you about the Word, and you're going to get a lot out of that. But then there's also something about this kind of stuff where they're talking to you about your prayer life and talking to you about the way you deal with other people and how you have relationships and how you serve in the local church. Those types of things are important also. And so at any given time, I always have 2 or 3 of these things that I read. So and you do that every morning. And the accumulation of this is really what's going to define your many times your contribution. You know, there's a ceiling on what you can contribute to somebody else, and that's what you've learned and what you know. If you want to pour into somebody's life, if you want the Word to be made flesh, right? That's a neat thought. It's not just for Jesus. Jesus was the Word made flesh, but you can think of that concept as being that Jesus' truth and Jesus' principles are supposed to become you, right? You are supposed to become like that. His Word is supposed to become flesh in you, just like God wrapped up Himself in Jesus' flesh and became the Word made flesh. That same principle applies to us. Jesus says that His words are spirit and they are life, and that when they are on the inside of us, they begin to change us to become like the Word. So the real key to the person that we're supposed to be in the kingdom is the entrance of His Word, right? And so we want to have this. It's not about just being smart. It's not just about being academic. It is the change that takes place when you commit yourself to being full of the Word, right? And when you read commentaries like this, your brain just naturally thinks about the Word all the time. Because it's one thing to just read through it straight from the Bible. That's important. I always do that. But in the commentary, you slow down because it may be 3 or 4 pages on a particular verse. And you kind of sit in the Word by reading these commentaries, and it begins to change how you think about the Word. And just that time spent in the Word begins to change you as an individual. So that's really what we're after. We don't go to college and spend all this time just to be smart. We go to college and spend all this time because we know that if we are full of the Word, we are changed and we become much more influential in the kingdom, right? So this is the single most important thing that the Lord's ever led me to do, is to spend the first few hours of every day doing something like this, right? So that is being a student, right? So now we're going to go into some content things, but it's important to think about the big picture of what we're doing, right, while we're learning these things. Okay, one thing I wanted to point out, this I've already given you, so if you remember I showed you this is the Rock of Beheston. One thing that I didn't point out when we did that lesson, I kind of went through it without giving you one of the main pieces. We talked about who this is, right? Darius the Great, and how he was one of the kings of the Persian Empire, and people thought that the Persian Empire, they had never heard much of Darius the Great, and so they had thought that he perhaps was not a real character, because the Bible talks about him as being one of the early leaders of the Persian Empire that kind of took over right after the Babylonians did. So the Babylonians, if you remember, were the ones that defeated Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. They exported some people from Judah into Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were part of that deportation. It's kind of interesting. The Bible talks about how many people were taken, and it hints towards closer to around 30,000, 20 to 30,000 or so people were taken from Jerusalem. And so a lot of times we think about that as being the big exiles when the temple was destroyed. But in reality, the Assyrians, when they attacked the northern 10 tribes, deported hundreds of thousands of people out of the northern 10 tribes. The attack on Jerusalem, the Bible gives us the number, and it was closer to 30,000 of people that were taken in those deportations. And it seems like they just deported enough to destabilize the leadership, right? That's all they were interested in doing. And I don't know if we talked about that in this class or not, but when these people would go to war, right? And we're going to talk about the conquest of Joshua here in a minute, but when enemy nations came to war, they normally had one reason and one reason only why they would go into a far-off country and kill a bunch of people, right? So what is the reason? And I know you guys know, so you're not allowed to say, because I've had this talk with you. If I'm an enemy king and I'm going to send my army all the way across the known world to fight a people I've never even seen before, which is what we have here with the Assyrians coming all across the world, and then later the Babylonians and Persians, to defeat a nation. Why? Right? Is it just that they're bloodthirsty?
Land grab.
Land is part of it, but why would you want to have just land, right? So like the king has, and that is part of it, the king has a whole bunch of stuff, right? So there is perhaps the ego side of wanting to gain land, but there's something else.
Eliminate the threat first.
All of those are close, but you're missing a very important thing. In fact, Bill Clinton hinted at this quite a bit in his run for president. Anybody remember his slogan? Bill Clinton's slogan when he ran for president? Surely I'm not the only one that remembers the 90s. It's the Nobody remembers this? Bill Clinton's campaign slogan? It's the blank stupid. It's the economy, stupid. That was Bill Clinton's run. When they asked him what was the most important thing that a president should be trying to fix, he said, it's the economy, stupid. And so that became his slogan, was that he was going to fix the economy. And that's why everybody wanted Bill Clinton. And that was his main thing. He was running on an economic platform that he was going to fix the economy, right? So anyways, that's the political class for the day. So the economy, right? When they would send these legions of soldiers halfway around the world, it was because they wanted your money. They wanted for you to keep working and having to pay them taxes. That's what it was all about. Even way back then. It was about, like when they would come, when the Assyrians would come in, they would not kill everyone. They would kill enough people to gain control. And they would leave a lot of people, particularly the Babylonians when they came into Judah. There were millions of people in Judah. They only deported 30,000. They deported the best and the brightest. They deported all of the leaders, and they put new leaders in place. But then who did they leave? The farmers, the workers. Because the reason they wanted the land in the beginning was so that all of these workers would then have to pay them taxes, and they could take all of their food, and they'd owe 20 to 30% of all the food that they grew in their field would come back to Babylon, right? And so that's what it was about. It was about the economy. It was about growing their resources. It was about money. It was about, for them, resources was money, and it was food. You see all through the Bible when an enemy nation would come up, it was either we're going to kill you or you give us a bunch of gold. You choose, right? And so because that's all they wanted, right, was your money. And so they would often deport leaders, leave the people, let them keep working. And so that was the reason why we see a lot of this expansion, right? We're going to talk about Joshua and his people here in a little bit because their goal was slightly different. But all of that was kind of a subtrail over this, right? Well, you guys were getting this out. That this was Darius the Mede, right? He was one of the kings of Persia, right? That they eventually destroyed the Babylonians. The Babylonians, as we just said, were the ones that came in and took over Judah, deported their leaders. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were part of this deportation. Anybody remember one other important person that came over with Daniel? With Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? It was Daniel, right? Okay, so that's the story. So they came over under Babylonian deportation, right? But during that time, the Persians overthrew Babylon, right? So we see here Daniel serving not just under the Babylonians, but then also keeping a very similar role under the Persians. And so this guy in this picture that I handed you, Darius the Mede, the reason I brought this back out again is because I went back and remembered the class and I didn't emphasize who this person was in the Bible, right? Not just that secular scholars didn't think he existed, but anybody remember the famous story of Darius the Mede?
Other than the fact that he threw Daniel in the lion's den.
Well, that's a famous story. We can start there. So this is Daniel chapter 6, right? And so this is Darius the Mede. He is the one that threw Daniel in the lion's den. And so this guy on this picture that they found, the king there is the guy that threw Daniel in the lion's den. This is Darius the Mede. So that's pretty cool. So I just wanted to point that out, that I talked about who it was, but we didn't go back in and talk about, what was he famous for, right? So this is the guy that threw Daniel in the lion's den.
That's another story verified. Not that- For the
Yeah,
world.
it verified, and you kind of get a picture of one of these people. I told you that Jehu, we talked about that last week, was one of the only pictures of an Israelite from someone who saw him. But this guy's not an Israelite, but he played an important role, right, in a very famous story, right? Okay.
The different Darius that Nehemiah built the wall.
That would have been, I want to say, that would have been Cyrus and Xerxes. Xerxes came after Darius. He was a pure Persian. Darius was a Mede. They were a kind of sister nation to the Persians. So the Medes kind of rose up first and overthrew Babylon. Then the Persians under Xerxes and later Cyrus kind of took over that same basic army because they were kind of connected. It'd be like Florida and Georgia going to war together. I mean, we're basically very similar, and so just maybe at one point the governor of Florida is leading it, so we called it, Rick Scott the Floridian, and then, later we've got the Georgia governor, and so, but it's still the same basic group between the Medes and the Persians, and so that would have been Xerxes, which he is the one that is the story of Esther, right? And then after the story of Esther comes Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus the Great is an important story in the Bible because he's the one that frees them to come back with not just with freedom to come back, but he gives them money to come back, right? Which is important. So he gives them all the resources they need. He says, when you show up there, tell them the king sent you, and you can have anything that you need to do whatever you need to do to build whatever it is you're wanting to go there and build. So that was Cyrus. And the reason that Cyrus' story is so important is because Isaiah, 300 and something years before, Isaiah is in the 700s, Cyrus and them would have been in the 400s to 300s, that Isaiah mentions him by name. And he says, I think it's in the chapter 40 or 43 of Isaiah, he talks about, he says, when Cyrus comes, he will release my people. And he will know that it was the Lord that raised him up. And so he mentions Cyrus like 2 or 3 times in that chapter. And so the story is that when Cyrus sat on the throne, that the Jews who were there brought the Bible to him and showed him that he had been mentioned hundreds of years before he was born by Isaiah. And that is what caused him to release the Jews and give them all the money that they needed, because he had been called out by name almost 400 years earlier, right? And so that is what allowed them to all come back, right?